Now, we looked at all these things, but let's make it a little more simple. Let's discuss this thing into breaking it down and making it far simpler than the previous one. So what I'm actually talking about is that the .m extension file and the .h extension file, or the header and the source file, are two different parts. Now, the header file you can actually think about like as if you are an architect and you are also a builder. So what does an architect do is that he designs, I'm not actually an architect, but what he does, he designs the layouts, he designs all the how the apartment, where the rooms will be, what sizes will they be, and how the apartment will look like, how the building will look like, how the flats will look like. So he designs all that into his computer, or on a sheet of paper or something like that. So what he does is that he's creating a virtual or a theoretical design, but he's not actually implementing it. So what does a builder do is that he takes the design and he implements, or he builds that building according to the plan, or according to that design that was designed by the architect. Now, similarly, in here, when we are talking about Objective-C's iPhone uh, development, iPhone application development, we have two of these files, the header file and the source file. So in the header file is like that virtual or the theoretical design that is not being implemented. Now, that you can actually think about that header file as being the design that was designed by the architect, but it does not really exist in the real world. It just exists inside the program, or where they created that theoretical design. Now, it only exists inside pen and paper. Now, in a source file, what does a source file do? It implements, it takes that design, it takes the design from the architect of the header file, and he implements it, or the builder, which is also a source file in this case, implements it so that it can really run as an application on our iPhones. Now, the second thing is that the main.m file is a source file. Now, the main.m file is a required. It must exist in all of our applications file. It must be a part of our applications, because this main.m file is triggered whenever an user wants to open up your iPhone app. Now, this main.m file, this main.m file doesn't need to be uh, it doesn't need to be changed unless it's a necessity. So it should stay the same, but we'll be doing all our editing, all our coding in some other formats. Now, we should be looking at what happens inside this .m extension files, or the source and the header files. In this case, we have two different things that are actually similar to C programming. Now, in Objective-C, you might often see these statements like this pound symbol. It's also called a pound symbol, and sometimes it's called a hash. So this pound symbol is followed by the import keyword, and then we get a file, a header file. Now, this import statement is also inside our .m or our source files. So what this import statement is doing, it is actually importing this master view controller header file into our source file. So this import statement is actually copying all of this code, all of this interface code, with this directives. We'll be discussing about these directives in a little while, so just bear with me. And it takes all of this code and it places them on the header section of this source file. Now, when we talk about directives, this one with this hash or the pound symbol, and this one with the @ symbol, is actually known as the directives. So there are two different type of directives. The first one is the preprocessor directive, and the second one is called the compiler directive. So this preprocessor directive is quite similar to our C programming. If you're quite adept at programming in C, then you would actually recognize this statement. In C, it's a little bit different in the sense that it includes the include statement. It's something like, although it will be a mistake, but I'm just showing it to you. It's something like this. So you get the includes you need the hash symbol or the pound symbol, and then it's followed by the include statement, and you're going to include all your files like this. So it works in a similar fashion like this, but it's not valid in case of our Objective-C program. So what is valid is that we need to use this import statement. Now, this import statement, as we have talked earlier, is called the Preprocessor Directive. So what we know about this Preprocessor Directive is that we can actually look at them in. There are two types. We'll be basically talking about the first two types is the import directive and the define directive. So I guess there is this define directive somewhere. Let's have a look. So this one is we have more of the compiler directives. We'll be talking about this compiler directives in a short while. So I guess we don't have the define directive right now. But what does this define directive? What it does, the define directive, it actually defines a constant for you. If you have programmed earlier in PHP or in other languages, you would actually find a way of defining a constant that does not change. Now the difference between a constant and a variable is that a constant, the value that is stored inside that constant, it needs to have a name, it needs to have an identifier. So an identifier is the name of the variable or the constant. So we'll be looking into this variable and the constant in a short while, but let us understand what the concepts are. So this constant, it takes a value and stores inside the memory. Now later on in the program, you can't actually change that constant. So by its name, we know that this constant cannot be changed in the course of our program. We cannot manipulate it, but we can only use the value that is stored inside our constant. Now, if we want to define a constant, we need to use the define keyword along with this pound symbol. And now let's define something called the age, and so we are going to define the age in the sense so let's write, suppose 40 or something like that. So we have a constant that is known as define age, that is known as age. So this constant has the identifier or the name age that holds the value of 40. So this 40, so this value of 40 will be stored inside the memory as with the name of age. Now in the later course of the program, you can't change this define, in this constant age. Now what happens with a variable is that a variable, as the name implies, it also needs to have an identifier or the name given by the programmer. So this variable also stores a value by itself inside the computer's memory. So what the difference is that the variable can be changed. You can change the value of the variable. You can concatenate or add more values to that value that is stored inside the memory, or you can actually create a copy of that variable into another variable. You can erase that variable completely from your memory, so you can do a lot of stuff with a variable, but with a constant it stays consistent. Now, so these things are important in the very basic part, but we'll be looking into it into more detail later on. But let us now understand what these compiler directives are. So these compiler directives are what actually they take the code, the Objective-C code, and they turn it into a literal C code. So